When we are pursuing hypertrophy, which is muscle size, it's a good idea for us to use a variety of rep ranges. Hey everybody, I thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this today. And the reasons for this are kind of multifold. One of them is almost common sense and practical, one of the primary reasons, but then the secondary reason, which again is less practical and more hypothetical, has to do with some possible implications of the scientific evidence regarding muscle growth. And we'll get into that a little more further into the video. But up front, some of it has to do with using just a little bit of common sense and practicality with our lifts. Because generally speaking, if we are trying to get as big as possible, we usually are doing a combination of big compound movements, right? Such as what you see me doing here, this wide grip bench press, doing rep work with 315, barbell squats, even big stuff like leg presses and stuff though, right? So we're going to see a variety of those, weighted pull-ups. You're going to see those exercises, but then we're also probably going to isolate things. And now for people who say, well, those big movements put on a lot of size, why do we need to isolate? Because they don't always work every muscle completely. And, we may be trying to bring up planes and heads of muscles that aren't getting worked as much on these things, right? So from that perspective, we do need both, right? There's an efficiency side to the big, heavy movements. We have the strength component, the neural drive, but there is that efficiency, meaning, a big exercise can work a wide variety of muscles, okay? May not work every one of those muscles thoroughly, and again, some of the smaller movements, they take way longer to do all of them or to work everything as much as you might like, especially, again, we start getting into some of the lower body stuff. Trying to isolate every muscle can become tedious for multiple exercises and multiple sets. It's a huge time component, and it just doesn't bring as much overall fitness to the table. So there's a lot to be said for the big movements, but those smaller movements, they work things that don't always get worked. Perfect examples like the long head of the triceps, a perfect example. It's the biggest of the three heads, right? It gets underworked on our big presses. Okay, it gets underworked, and that's been studied in the lab. We know that's true both in terms of biomechanics. We know that's true in terms of actual muscle growth studies. Okay, like bench pressing, even close grip, works the lateral head and builds the lateral head of the tricep more, and the long head less than, say, extensions, more isolation work. So that's a perfect example. We've got different ones looking at proximal and distal parts of muscles like hamstrings. Another big example, a lot of the big movements tend to work the top half of the hamstring more, and the lower insertions, that lower third, almost requires isolation or certain more knee bend type movements, right? And the only big movements you're going to do for that's going to be a glute ham raise, and most people don't have access to one. So that's an example. So this is what I mean by we probably do need both. And then there's there's the whole training economy, and then there's even the recovery aspect. We can only handle so much of the big movements too. Smaller movements are just overall easier to just fill in all those gaps, and they're easier on recovery. So from that viewpoint, people say, okay, I get that, but can't we just do the same rep ranges on all of them? Well, in theory, but from a practical perspective, trying to go some of your big movements, doing even 10 rep sets, is absolutely tedious. Absolutely tedious. Okay, so a lot of the bigger movements that we do, it makes sense to keep reps a little bit lower. Absolutely makes sense. So from a practical perspective, again, and I'm not saying I don't ever do them, 15 and 20 rep squats are ridiculously tedious. And even the soreness, the exhaustion we get from a lot of these big movements, if we try to do them for really high reps, they're almost turned into cardio. Okay, so from a practical perspective, doing tons and tons of that, it's just going to be tedious and grind you into the ground. It's grueling. Whereas in doing heavier weight with them gives just as much muscle mass, right? The study shows. So all the data shows 5 to 6 reps builds just as much muscle as 10 or 15 or 20. So it makes sense to do them with mostly slightly lower rep ranges. A lot of the small movements, see where we're going, it's easier to maintain stricter form on a lot of the isolation work with higher reps. Some of them really beat you up. A lot of these movements, if you try to do 6 to 8 reps, they really beat your tendons and joints up a lot on the smaller exercises. So it makes sense to use a couple different rep ranges. All right, just from a practical training perspective, in other words, low to even moderate reps on your big exercises. Of course, you guys see me do 12s or whatever with sometimes benching and weighted pull-ups and stuff, and that's fine. But that is keeping in mind that is the higher end of the scale, in terms of what you would want to do on those big movements. The lower the isolation work, we usually want 10 or more reps. And a lot of those really do better on our joints and tendons, even doing 12, 15, sometimes even sets of 20. Okay, so there's the practical end of it. So right there, it kind of makes sense to already use a couple rep ranges. Again, big, heavy work followed by pump work, right? Old school, time-proven protocol. Then we get into the hypothetical. All right, a lot of the research that's looked at things has generally found exactly what I said. 5 reps, 10 reps, 20 reps, they all produce pretty similar amounts of muscle growth as long as rate of perceived exertion and proximity to failure is the same. What does that mean? How hard they are. In other words, doing a set of 5 to failure versus a set of 20 to failure, or stopping 1 rep short of failure. Okay, it's going to produce pretty much almost identical amounts of muscle growth. All right, we know this. So people say, so what's the point of doing a couple? Well, what I've seen some of the best experts out there point out, we're still looking at the evidence of this further, but there could be, and some of the actual PhDs and experts have speculated, we are eventually going to see data that shows slightly different pathways for hypertrophy, meaning 5 rep or 6 rep sets and 20 rep sets might have a slightly different pathway through which they cause muscle growth, because we don't fully understand the muscle growth stimulus process. We don't. And if that's the case, you see where we're going? If that's the case, if there could be some slight differences in the pathways and metabolic pathways and stuff involved, you're probably going to have a little more growth potential if you do different rep ranges. In other words, probably doing some 6 to 8 reps, along with even some 15 to 20 for the same muscles. If that is the case, and we don't know that it is, but again, there's a speculation that we'll find some data on it. As the science evolves, the technology to measure it changes, and it's a very reasonable hypothesis. Unproven, but because of the hypothetical potential for it, and since they all can produce good muscle growth, there's no reason not to use 2 or 3 different rep ranges. So you may be ahead of the curve in doing so. It's a good idea. There's no real downside to doing it, and there's at least some hypothetical potential benefits. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.